Elena Vasquez had survived 2 station reassignments, 1 cafeteria explosion, and a very unfortunate misunderstanding involving a Torvani ambassador and a cheese platter. But nothing in her career had prepared her for this. The Von Hard diplomatic station hung in the black between 2 spiral arms of the galaxy like a seed caught in the wind, spinning slow and silver against the stars, and somewhere deep inside its rotating hull was a crash wing that most people pretended did not exist. The Predator Wing. Elena stood outside the reinforced doors and read the sign bolted to the wall for the 3rd time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. Caution. Rythkai and Skarathi juveniles housed beyond this point. Authorized personnel only. Protective equipment recommended. She did not have protective equipment, and she was fairly sure her authorization was less of a vote of confidence and more of a quiet surrender by the station command. Station's Integration Council, who had run out of other options. The last attendant had been a Pelori, a tall, gentle, 4-armed herbivore with a reputation for patience that bordered on sainthood. And he had lasted exactly 11 days before submitting a transfer request written in handwriting so shaky it looked like he had composed it during an earthquake. The one before him had lasted 6. Elena pressed the door panel and walked in. The creche was large and circular, with padded walls that showed claw marks in long parallel lines, and a floor made of something rubbery that squeaked under her boots, and the lighting was set to a warm amber that was supposed to be calming, but instead made everything look like the inside of a furnace. 12 cubs occupied the space, and every single one of them turned to look at her the moment she entered. 6 were Rythkai, wolf-like creatures the size of large dogs, covered in dense silver-blue fur, with 6 limbs, and jaws that could snap through bone, and eyes that glowed faintly gold in the amber light. And even at their young age, they moved with a kind of liquid confidence that said very clearly that they knew exactly what they were built for. The other 6 were Skarathi, low-slung reptilian predators with mottled green-black scales and claws that curved like fishing hooks, and their eyes were slitted and cold, and tracked movement with a precision that made Elena's skin prickle, and their tails were thick and muscular, and ended in hard ridges that could break a limb if swung with intent. They ranged from 3 to 6 in human equivalent development, which meant they were old enough to be fast and strong, and young enough to have absolutely no self-control. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the largest Rythkai cub, a male with a torn ear and a scar across his muzzle that he had probably earned last week, let out a sound somewhere between a bark and a challenge. The room exploded into motion. 2 Skarathi cubs bolted in opposite directions, one scaling the padded wall with terrifying speed, and 3 Rythkai cubs slammed into each other in what was either a greeting or a fight or both. And a tiny Skarathi cub hissed at Elena from behind an overturned mat with its claws fully extended. And the big Rythkai cub with the torn ear, Kale, according to the file Elena had memorized, stalked toward her, with his head low and his lips pulled back to show every single one of his teeth. Elena stood very still and let him approach. Kale circled her twice, sniffing, his gold eyes never leaving her face, and when he was close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath on her hand, he snapped his jaws shut an inch from her fingers. She did not flinch. It was not bravery, exactly, or at least not the kind that came from courage, but rather the kind that came from having grown up with 3 older brothers and a grandmother who believed that showing fear to anything, dogs, bullies, tax collectors, was a personal failure. Kale stared at her, and she stared back, and after a long moment he made a sound deep in his chest that might have been confusion, and trotted away. The first hour was chaos in its purest form. Elena watched and took notes on a battered datapad while the cubs wrestled, chased, pounced, bit, hissed, snarled, and generally treated the creche like a combat arena. And she noticed several things very quickly. First, the Rithkai cubs and the Skarathi cubs did not play together. Not ever, not even once, and the invisible line between their territories was as sharp and clear as if someone had drawn it on the floor. Second, the cubs were rough, even by predator standards, drawing blood from each other without any real malice, but also without any hesitation. And the medkit mounted on the wall had been used so many times that its surface was scratched dull. Third, most importantly, the cubs hit a wall around midday. It happened like a switch being flipped somewhere inside their small, fierce bodies. And Elena watched it with the focused attention of someone who had spent 10 years working with children of various species, and knew exhaustion when she saw it. The wrestling slowed and became sloppy, and the pouncing lost its precision, and the snarling turned from playful to genuinely irritable. And one by one the cubs started making mistakes, bumping into walls, tripping over their own limbs, snapping at each other over nothing at all. Kale, the big torn-eared cub, who had tried to intimidate her that morning, got into a vicious scuffle with a Skarathi cub over a chew toy that neither of them actually wanted, and the fight ended when Kale stumbled sideways and walked directly into a wall with a thud that made Elena wince. He sat down hard, shook his head, blinked his gold eyes in bleary confusion, and then snarled at the wall, as if it had attacked him. Pause. Elena pulled up the creche records on her datapad and scrolled through the behavioral logs, and the pattern was there in the data, as clear as a heartbeat. Every single afternoon, aggression spiked, injuries doubled, and the notes from previous attendants were full of phrases like unmanageable after midday, and recommend sedative protocols, and requesting immediate transfer. Nobody had considered the obvious answer, because the obvious answer was something that predator species did not do: sleep during the day. Both the Rithkai and the Skarathi were warrior cultures to their core. And in warrior cultures, sleep was vulnerability, and vulnerability was death, and even the youngest cubs had already absorbed this lesson like water into bone. You sleep at night, in a secured den, with sentries posted, and you never ever close your eyes when the sun is up, because closing your eyes means something bigger and meaner might open you up. The idea of a nap, a voluntary midday casual surrender to unconsciousness, was so alien to them that it did not even have a word in either language. Elena watched Kale slump against the wall, his eyelids heavy, his small body vibrating with the effort of staying awake. And she watched him snarl at a Skarathi cub named Fesic, who had done nothing except walk past him. And she watched Fesic hiss back with her claws out, even though her pupils were so wide with fatigue that she looked half-drugged. These were babies. Fierce, clawed, fanged, dangerous babies, but babies all the same, and they were exhausted, and nobody had ever told them it was okay to rest. Elena closed her datapad and tucked it under her arm, and looked at the room full of tiny predators who were fighting sleep harder than they had ever fought anything else in their short lives. Right, she said quietly to herself, watching Kale bump into the wall a second time and snarl at it. Again, with diminishing conviction, we are fixing this. Elena did not make the mistake of telling the cubs what she was planning. She had worked with enough species to know that you could not order a predator to do anything, and you especially could not order a predator to do the one thing its entire culture had spent 10,000 years teaching it never to do. And you most especially could not order 12 small predators with more teeth than sense to lie down and close their eyes in a room full of other predators. So she did not order anything at all. She started with the lights. On the third day of her assignment, right around the time the midday crash usually began, Elena walked to the environmental panel on the wall and turned the creche lighting down by about 20%. And she did it slowly enough that most of the cubs did not notice. And the ones who did notice looked around with vague suspicion, but could not figure out what had changed. The wrestling continued, but it was a little quieter. Snarling had a little less edge to it, and one of the smaller Rithkai cubs sat down in the corner and stared at nothing for a while, before getting up again. The next day, Elena turned the lights down by 30% and added something new. Music. Not loud music, not anything with rhythm or energy, but a low, slow human lullaby that her grandmother used to hum while shelling peas on the back porch of a house in Oaxaca that smelled like rain and clay and wood smoke. And Elena had recorded it years ago and kept it on her personal device, the way other people kept photographs. She played it through the creche speakers at a volume so low it was barely there, more a vibration in the air than a sound, and she watched what happened. The Rithkai cubs went still. Every single one of them stopped what they were doing and lifted their heads, and their ears, tall, pointed ears lined with fine silver fur, rotated forward and locked onto the sound, and something in their gold eyes shifted from alert to something softer and older and harder to name. Elena had read in the xenobiology files that Rithkai had subvocal hearing ranges that extended well below what most species could detect, and the low frequencies of the lullaby were hitting those ranges like a key sliding into a lock. The Skarathi reacted differently, but just as strongly, and Elena watched their behavior with careful attention, because Skarathi had thermal pit receptors along their jaws that were sensitive to vibration as well as heat, and the deep hum of the music was reaching them through the floor and the walls and the air itself, and several of them pressed their bellies flat against the ground and closed their inner eyelids halfway, which was the Skarathi equivalent of a cat beginning to purr. Nobody slept, not yet, but the creche was quieter that afternoon than it had ever been, and when Elena checked the behavioral logs at the end of the day, there had been 0 injuries after midday for the first time in the program's history. On the 5th day, she brought the blankets. They were human blankets, soft, thick, made of a synthetic material that held warmth without overheating. And they came in colors that Elena had chosen carefully, deep blues and dark greens that would feel like shadows to predator eyes, rather than the bright whites and sterile grays that filled the rest of the station. She carried them into the creche in a stack that came up to her chin and set them on the floor without ceremony, and the cubs surrounded them immediately with the intense focused curiosity that young predators reserved for anything new in their territory. Kale was the first to investigate, shoving his muzzle into the pile and sniffing with such force that he inhaled a corner of fabric and had to sneeze it out, which startled the Skarathi cub so badly that she leaped 3 feet sideways and hissed at the ceiling. Encountered anything like this before, and Elena could see the confusion in their body language as they pawed and sniffed and bit at the blankets, because predator species did not make soft things on purpose. Rithkai used cured hides, and Skarathi used heated stone slabs, and both cultures treated comfort as something that happened by accident, rather than something you built with intention. The idea that someone would create a material whose only purpose was to feel good against skin and fur was so bizarre to them that they did not know how to categorize it, and Elena watched them try to figure out if the blankets were food, or toys, or enemies, or territory markers, before eventually settling on interesting but confusing. Then she did the thing that would later be discussed in 16 different species academic journals and 2 unauthorized biographies. She took a blanket, spread it on the floor in the middle of the creche, lay down on it, and closed her eyes. Room went absolutely silent. 12 predator cubs stood frozen around a human woman who had just voluntarily made herself the most vulnerable creature on the station. And the silence had a quality to it that was less quiet and more the moment before something very significant happens. Elena kept her breathing slow and even, and she let her heartbeat do what it naturally did when she was calm, which was settle into a deep, steady rhythm that she knew from the xenobiology files would be audible to every Rythkai ear and detectable by every Skorathi thermal pit in the room. She was not actually asleep, not yet, but she was genuinely relaxed, because Elena Vasquez believed with absolute conviction that these cubs would not hurt her. Not because they could not, but because they were children. And children everywhere in the galaxy responded to the same things, which were safety and warmth, and the knowledge that a grown creature nearby was not afraid. Nothing happened. Then she heard the soft pad of feet on the rubber floor, and she felt the displacement of air as something small and warm moved close to her side. And she kept her eyes closed as a cold, wet nose pressed against her wrist and sniffed along her arm to her shoulder, and then down to the spot where her heartbeat was strongest. Kale. He stood over her for a long time, so close she could feel the heat of him through her uniform, and she could hear his breathing, fast at first, then gradually slowing as her own slow rhythm pulled at something instinctive inside him. And then she felt the weight of him as he lowered himself beside her, not quite touching, his body tense and ready to bolt. He lasted 4 seconds before he leaped up and scrambled to the far side of the room, where he paced in tight circles and made small distressed sounds, as if he had just done something shameful. Elena did not open her eyes and did not react. The next day, Kale, lasted 10 seconds. The day after that, 30. On the 8th day he lay down beside her and did not get up, and his breathing slowed to match hers, and his gold eyes drifted shut, and his 6 limbs curled inward, and he slept. He slept for 40 minutes with his spine pressed against her ribs, and his torn ear twitching with dreams. And when he woke, he looked around the room with an expression of bewildered peace that Elena had never seen on a Rythkai face before. The other cubs had watched every moment of this, and the next day 2 more Rythkai cubs joined the pile. And the day after that, a Skorathi cub named Thesic, the one with the mottled green-black scales and the cold, intelligent eyes, crept forward and draped herself across Elena's legs with the careful precision of someone performing a scientific experiment. By the end of the 2nd week, Elena disappeared under the pile every midday. It was not graceful, and it was not organized. A lot of elbows and tails, and one memorable occasion when a Skorathi cub fell asleep on her face. But it worked, and every afternoon 12 predator cubs who had been raised to believe that daytime sleep was weakness lay down together in a warm heap of fur and scales and blankets and slept like they had never slept before. The creche security cameras recorded everything, because creche security cameras always recorded everything. And Elena did not think about this, because she was busy being a pillow for 12 tiny apex predators. She should have thought about it. Because on day 15, someone on the station's network found the footage, and by day 16, everyone on the Vonhar diplomatic station had seen a human woman buried under a pile of the most dangerous juvenile predators in the sector, all of them deeply and peacefully asleep. And the footage was spreading through the galactic communication networks faster than Elena could say, "Oh no," were immediate and varied and loud. The prey species were horrified, because a human sleeping willingly in a pile of predator cubs confirmed everything they had always suspected about humans, which was that they were completely insane. The other predator species were confused, because the cubs looked comfortable in a way that predator cubs were not supposed to look, and this was unsettling for reasons none of them could quite articulate. And the Rythkai and Skorathi delegations on the station went very, very quiet, which was the most dangerous reaction of all. Elena had not planned to start a cultural revolution, but the cubs apparently had their own ideas about that. It began on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday, on a station that orbited nothing and measured its days by the agreement of 17 species timekeeping committees. When Kale stood up at exactly 1200 hours station time, lifted his scarred muzzle toward the ceiling, and howled. It was not a hunting howl, or a warning howl, or any of the documented HFY vocalizations that Elena had studied in her orientation files, but something new and entirely his own invention. A long, rising note that started in his chest and climbed until it rang off the padded walls like a bell. And when it ended, he looked around the creche with his gold eyes blazing, and announced in broken galactic common, loud enough to be heard in the corridor outside, "Sleep pile time." The other cubs responded instantly. 3 HFY cubs grabbed blankets in their jaws and dragged them to the center of the room, and 2 Skarathi cubs began herding a reluctant newcomer, a young HFY pup, who had just joined the creche that week and did not yet understand what was happening, toward the growing nest. And Fesic climbed onto the highest mat in the room and hissed once, sharp and clear, which meant lights, and then hissed twice, which meant everyone get to the pile zone, now. Elena had not taught them any of this. She had not created a schedule, or a system, or a set of rules, because she had learned very early that predator cubs did not follow rules that were given to them, but would defend to the death rules that they made themselves. And what the cubs had done was take the nap and make it theirs. The new pup, a small female HFY with pale blue fur and enormous frightened eyes, tried to resist, because she had only been in the creche for 2 days and nobody had explained anything to her, and she planted her 6 paws and whined with the bane, high, thin sound of a child who does not understand why everyone is lying down when there are still things to chase. Kale walked up to her with the calm authority of a cub who had decided he was in charge, and gently but firmly took the scruff of her neck in his jaws and carried her to the pile and deposited her in the center between 2 warm Skarathi bodies, and the new pup squirmed for about 30 seconds before the warmth and the weight and the slow breathing of everyone around her pulled her under like a tide, and she was asleep before Elena had even reached for her own blanket. It happened every day after that, and it happened with a precision that would have impressed a military commander. Kale was the announcer and the recruiter, the one who howled the signal and personally collected any cub who was slow to comply. And Fesic was the operations manager, the one who tracked the blankets and managed the formation, and decided who went where in the pile based on criteria that Elena could not fully decode, but suspected had to do with who had been most irritable that morning, and therefore needed to be in the warmest spot. The other cubs had roles too, because predator children are natural organizers when they have something worth organizing. And within a week, they had built a system so efficient that the entire creche went from full activity to complete unconsciousness in under 4 minutes. Elena watched all of this with the quiet pride of someone who had lit a match, and was now watching the fire decide on its own what shape to become. The behavioral data was extraordinary. She tracked it carefully on her datapad, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she knew that sooner or later someone was going to ask very hard questions, and she wanted to have very clear answers. And what the data showed made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a long time. Afternoon aggression had dropped by 90%, and that remaining 10% was almost entirely playful scuffling that never drew blood. And injuries during the post-nap hours had fallen to 0 for 3 straight weeks, which was a record so unprecedented that the station medical staff had sent her a message asking if her reporting system was broken. But the numbers that made Elena's throat tight were the social ones. The HFY cubs and the Skarathi cubs were playing together, not just coexisting, not just tolerating each other's presence in the way that the Integration Council's reports always described as adequate interspecies baseline, but actually playing, chasing each other in mixed groups, sharing toys without snarling, grooming each other's fur and scales with the casual intimacy of siblings. Kale and Fesic had become inseparable, and Elena watched them move through the creche like two halves of the same creature, the big silver-furred wolf cub and the sleek green-scaled reptile cub. And they had developed a communication system that blended Rithkai subvocal rumbles with Skorathi hiss patterns into something that was neither language and both languages at once. And other cubs were starting to copy it. This was the thing that the integration program had been trying to achieve for 40 years. And 12 children had done it by accident, because a human woman had shown them it was safe to sleep. Elena knew the data was good, and she knew the results were real, and she also knew, with the certainty of long experience, that good results in a politically sensitive program were not a shield, but a target. Because someone was always watching, and someone always had an opinion, and someone always thought they knew better. The someone, in this case, was two someones, and they arrived at the creche on the same afternoon with the kind of timing that suggested the universe had a sense of dramatic structure. Commander Vorak Sen of the Rithkai military delegation was enormous even by Rithkai standards. A scarred, silver-maned veteran whose 6 limbs moved with the coiled economy of a creature who had spent decades deciding what to kill and how. And his gold eyes were harder and colder than any cub's. And when he walked into the creche, the cubs scattered like leaves in a wind. All except Kale, who stood his ground, and stared up at his uncle with the unshakable confidence of a 5-year-old, who has recently discovered the power of naps. Matriarch Ishka of the Skorathi brood delegation was smaller, but no less terrifying. A dark-scaled female whose claws had been sharpened to surgical points, and whose tail moved behind her with the slow, deliberate swing of a weapon being aimed, and her slitted eyes surveyed the creche with the expression of someone cataloging failures. They had come because of the footage and because of the reports, and because their respective governments had contacted them with questions that were really instructions, and the instructions were really threats. Vorak spoke first, because Rithkai always spoke first when they were angry, and his voice was a low rumble that made the floor vibrate. You are teaching warrior cubs to sleep like prey. Elena stood in front of him, with her datapad under her arm, and her heart beating very fast, and her face showing nothing at all, because she had learned that lesson from her grandmother too, which was that you could be terrified as long as you were terrified with good posture. I am teaching them to nap, she said. There is no difference, Ishka said from behind her, and her voice was the dry rustle of scales on stone. You are training the instinct out of them, making them soft, making them vulnerable, making them something they were not born to be. With respect, matriarch, they were born tired. Ishka's tail stopped moving, which was worse than if she had swung it. The Integration Council convened an emergency session that evening in the station's main chamber, a circular room with tiered seating, designed so that every species could see every other species, which had the effect of making everyone feel equally watched. And Elena was called to the center to explain herself. She stood under the lights with her datapad and her data and 12 security clips queued up on the display behind her, and 2 of the most dangerous predator species representatives in the sector, staring down at her from the upper tier. And she thought about her grandmother, who had once faced down a landlord, a county inspector, and a rattlesnake in the same afternoon, and had come out on top of all 3. With respect, Commander, Matriarch, Elena said, and her voice was steady because she had decided it would be. Your children are not weaker. They are the first mixed-species predator cohort in this program's history that has not had a serious mauling incident in 3 consecutive weeks. The first to demonstrate voluntary cross-species social bonding, without pharmaceutical intervention. She pulled up the data on the display behind her, and let the numbers speak in their clean, unambiguous language. You can take that up with my spreadsheet. The Integration Council chamber was silent in the way that a room full of 17 species could be silent, which was not truly silent at all, but a layered hush, made up of held breaths and twitching tails and the soft click of claws on armrests, and the rustle of every body leaning forward at once. Commander Vorak Sen rose from his seat in the upper tier, and when a Rithkai of his size rose, it was less like a person standing, and more like a landscape rearranging itself. And his voice filled the chamber without effort, because it was a voice that had been built by evolution and training to carry across battlefields. "You show us numbers," he said, and his gold eyes were fixed on Elena, like targeting systems. "Numbers can be made to say anything. I have seen analysts build fortresses out of data that collapsed the moment they were tested against reality. And what I see in that footage is not strength, but domestication." He let the word land like a blade. "Stone. Rithkai cubs do not sleep in piles. Rithkai cubs sleep in dens, alone or with their birth pack, behind walls and under guard. Because the galaxy taught us 10,000 years ago that anything else is an invitation to die. And you, human, are undoing in weeks what our ancestors paid for in blood." A murmur moved through the chamber, and Elena could feel it like a change in air pressure. And she could see the representatives of a dozen species processing this, the prey species nodding because they understood fear, the other predator species shifting uncomfortably because they understood pride, and the humans in the room doing what humans always did in tense situations, which was looking at each other with expressions that said, "Well, this is going to be interesting." Matriarch Ishka spoke next, and she did not stand because Skarathi conducted authority from stillness, and her voice was quiet in a way that demanded more attention than Vorak's rumble. "Commander speaks from culture," she said. "I speak from biology. Skarathi hatchlings are solitary from the moment they break their shells, and they bond only with their clutchkin through shared scent and territory. And what your footage shows is Skarathi cubs bonding with non-clutch, non-species individuals. Which means one of two things. Either your methods are artificially stimulating hormonal responses that will create dependency and confusion, or you have somehow broken a biological pattern that has held stable for longer than your species has existed." She paused. "Neither option is acceptable." Elena opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a door at the side of the chamber opened, and a woman walked in, carrying a stack of data tablets, and wearing the expression of someone who had not slept in 3 days, and was fueled entirely by caffeine and righteous scientific fury. Dr. Amandi Osei was the station's chief xenobiologist, and she was short and round, and had hair that she kept in tight braids decorated with small silver beads that clicked when she moved her head, and she walked to the center of the chamber with the unhurried confidence of a person who had facts, and knew that facts were the most dangerous weapons in any room. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, in a tone that conveyed absolutely no apology whatsoever. "But I have been running tests on the Predator Crash cohort for the past 2 weeks, and the Council needs to see this data before it makes any decisions it cannot undo." She activated the main display, and the chamber filled with light. "Cortisol analog levels," she said, and a chart appeared showing 2 lines, one from before Elena's nap protocol, and one from after, and the difference was not subtle. 60% reduction across both species. These cubs are experiencing less stress than any recorded predator juvenile cohort in the integration program's history. And for context, the previous best result was a 12% reduction, achieved through pharmaceutical intervention that had to be discontinued because of liver damage. She moved to the next chart. Neural development markers. And I want the Council to pay close attention here, because this is where it gets interesting. The display showed brain scans. Rithkai on the left, Skarathi on the right, and even to non-scientists, the difference was visible, because the after scans were lit up with connections like cities seen from orbit, bright webs of neural pathways that had not existed 8 weeks ago. "These cubs are learning faster," Dr. Osei said. "Their memory consolidation has improved by a factor that I had to recheck 4 times because I thought my equipment was malfunctioning." And the reason is simple and should be obvious to anyone who has ever studied the neuroscience of sleep, which apparently does not include whoever designed the original creche. She looked up at the tiered seating with an expression that could have etched glass. Sleep is when the brain processes what it has learned. It is not downtime. It is construction time. And these cubs have been running on fumes since they were born, because their cultures told them that the construction crew should never be allowed to work. Vorak's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Dr. Ose brought up the next set of data, and her voice softened in a way that made the chamber pay even closer attention, because scientists who get quiet are scientists who are about to say something that matters. Bonding hormones, she said, specifically the oxytocin analogs native to each species. In Rithkai, it is called vetherin, and it governs pack loyalty, and in Skorathi, it is called thermal bonding compound, and it governs clutch recognition. And in both species, these hormones are produced primarily during two activities: nursing in infancy and physical proximity during sleep. She let that sentence sit in the air. The cubs are not confused. They are not being manipulated or domesticated or broken. They are doing exactly what their biology was designed to do, which is form bonds with the creatures they sleep beside. And the fact that those creatures happen to be from a different species is not a malfunction. It is a feature that has been suppressed for so long that everyone forgot it existed. The chamber was very quiet now. Dr. Ose pulled up her final display, and it was not a chart or a scan, but a historical analysis, dense with citations and cross-references, and the kind of meticulous documentation that only a scientist with a personal grudge against ignorance would compile at 3 a.m. Both the Rithkai and the Skorathi ancestral species were polyphasic sleepers, she said, and she said it directly to Vorak and Ishka. Your pre-civilization ancestors slept multiple times per day, communal groups, because that is what apex predators do when they are not actively hunting. Lions do it, wolves do it, crocodilians do it, and your ancestors did it. And it was your militarized cultures that trained it out over the last several thousand years, not because it was weak, but because it was inconvenient for armies that needed soldiers awake at all hours. She closed her display. You did not lose a weakness, you lost a strength. And a human who works with children noticed it before any of your own scientists did. And you can be angry about that, or you can be grateful. But either way, the biology does not care about your feelings. Vorak stared at her, and his expression was something Elena had never seen on a Rithkai face before, which was the look of a warrior being told that the enemy was not the enemy, and never had been. Ishka's claws had retracted fully, and she sat very still, with her tail curled around her feet, and her slitted eyes were distant. In the way that meant a Skorathi was thinking very deeply about something that could not be solved with claws. The chamber waited, and then the side door opened again, very slowly, and a small silver-furred shape pushed through the gap and padded across the chamber floor with the absolute confidence of a creature who had never once considered the possibility that there was anywhere in the galaxy he was not allowed to go. Kale had escaped from the creche. He walked past Dr. Ose with a brief sniff of acknowledgement, walked past Elena with a tail wag that was almost surely a coincidence, and walked directly to the base of the tiered seating where Commander Vorak Sen, decorated veteran, military attaché, the most dangerous Rithkai on the station, sat rigid in his seat. Kale looked up at his uncle with gold eyes that were bright and clear and rested in a way that Vorak's were not. And he reached up with one small paw and tugged on the combat harness that crossed Vorak's massive chest. And he said in his clear, small, confident voice, "You look tired. You should come to sleep, pile." The chamber went so quiet that Elena could hear the station's rotation hum. Vorak stared down at the cub, at his nephew, at this small, fierce creature who was supposed to be learning to be a warrior, and had instead learned something that no Rithkai had known for 3,000 years. And his jaw worked, and his throat moved, and his gold eyes did something that Elena had genuinely not known Rithkai eyes could do. they went soft. He looked at Elena. She shrugged. It was the only honest response she had. 6 months changed many things on the Vonhar diplomatic station, but the most important changes were the quiet ones. The Integration Council had voted unanimously, a thing so rare that several delegates checked the voting system for errors, to adopt Elena's NAP protocol across all predator species creche groups on the station. And within 3 months, 2 other diplomatic stations had requested her consultation, and within 5 months, the Galactic Integration Authority had published a revised set of guidelines for mixed-species juvenile care that included, for the first time in its history, the word nap. Elena had read the guidelines and noted with amusement that the official terminology was structured midday somatic recovery period, because bureaucracies could make anything sound like a medical procedure. But the cubs on every station that adopted it simply called it what Kale had always called it, sleep pile time. The words had spread the way children's words always spread, which was without permission, or planning, or respect for political boundaries, carried from creche to creche and station to station by the small fierce mouths of cubs who did not understand diplomacy, but understood very well the feeling of being warm and safe and tired, and having someone say that it was okay to close your eyes. But Elena did not think about policy changes or guidelines, or the 3 interview requests from galactic media outlets that sat unanswered on her datapad. Because Elena's world was still the creche, and the creche was where the real story lived. Kale was 6 now, in human equivalent terms, and he had grown into his torn ear and his confidence in equal measure. And he stood at the center of the creche each day, like a small silver general, surveying his domain. And his howl at 1200 hours had become so reliable that the station's maintenance crew used it to check their chronometers. He had not lost any of his fierceness. He still wrestled harder than any other cub, still ran faster, still bared his teeth when challenged, but there was something behind his eyes now that had not been there before, a kind of steadiness that came not from the absence of fear, but from the knowledge that fear was not the only way to be strong. Fesic had grown too, longer and sleeker, her mottled scales darkening to a deep forest green that caught the light like water, and she moved through the creche with the quiet authority of someone who had catalogued every variable and found them all manageable. And her hiss code system had expanded into something so complex that Dr. Osei had started documenting it as a potential new form of interspecies communication. They were inseparable in the way that siblings were inseparable. Not always together, not always agreeing, but connected by something deeper than proximity, a bond that had been built in the warm, dark space between sleep and waking, where the body remembers who was beside it, and the brain decides that this creature is mine, and I am theirs. The other cubs had followed their lead, and the creche that had once been divided into 2 hostile territories was now a single space, where silver fur and green scales moved together in patterns that looked, from a distance, like a single living thing, breathing in and out. New cubs came every few weeks, transferred in from other programs, or arriving with newly posted diplomatic families, and they always arrived the same way, tense, claws out, eyes wide, ready to fight or flee, because that was what their cultures had taught them the world required. Kale collected each one personally. He would walk up to the new arrival with his tail low and his ears forward and his gold eyes calm, and he would sniff them once, and then he would press his flank against theirs, a Rithkai gesture of pack acceptance that was supposed to be reserved for blood kin, and he would walk them to the center of the room where the blankets waited. Fesic would handle the rest, assigning them a spot in the pile, and a partner to sleep beside, and a blanket in a color that she chose, based on criteria that nobody else understood, but that always seemed to be exactly right. The new cubs usually resisted for the first day, sometimes 2, but never longer than 3, because the pull of 12 sleeping bodies was stronger than any lesson about vulnerability, and because Kale's patience was absolute, and Thesek's logistics were flawless. Commander Vorak Sen had changed too, though he would have denied it with every breath in his massive body. He had fought the Council's decision for 2 weeks after that night in the chamber, filing formal objections and requesting independent reviews, and doing everything a career military officer could do, when the ground he had built his life on was shifting under his feet. And then one afternoon he had stopped fighting, and nobody quite knew why. Elena knew why. Because Elena had access to the security cameras. 3 days after the council session, Vorak had appeared in the observation gallery above the creche during nap time, standing at the window with his 6 arms folded and his face hard, watching the pile of sleeping cubs below with an expression that dared them to prove him wrong. He came back the next day and the next, and each day he stood a little closer to the glass, and his arms were folded a little less tightly, and his face was a little less hard. On the 7th day, he came down from the gallery and sat in a chair in the corridor outside the creche, close enough to hear the lullaby through the wall, and he sat there with military straight posture, and his eyes open, and his jaw set. On the 10th day, Elena came out of the creche after settling the cubs, and found him in the chair with his eyes closed and his breathing slow and deep and even, and draped across his enormous armored chest was a small blue blanket that could only have come from the creche, which meant that Kale had somehow gotten out of the pile and through the door and tucked his uncle in without Elena noticing, which was either deeply impressive or deeply concerning, and possibly both. Elena said nothing, because some things were too important for words, but she did take a second blanket from the supply closet and drape it over his legs, because his legs were very long, and the chair was very small, and even decorated military veterans deserved to have their knees warm. She never mentioned it, and he never mentioned it, and from that day forward there was simply always a chair in the corridor and a blanket on the chair, and if the chair was sometimes occupied during midday hours, that was nobody's business but the station's. Matriarch Ishka predictably went further. Ishka was Skorathi, and Skorathi did not do anything by accident or half-measure. Blankets were valuable. She did what any Skorathi matriarch would do, which was claim them for her people in the most face-saving way possible. She submitted a formal requisition to the station's supply department for 200 units of tactical thermal regulation aids, matching the exact specifications of Elena's creche blankets, intended for distribution aboard Skorathi military vessels as environmental adaptation equipment. The requisition form was 7 pages long and included technical diagrams and thermal conductivity analyses, and a section on strategic applications in variable temperature deployment scenarios that was so elaborately written it was almost beautiful. Everyone on the station knew they were blankets. Everyone on the station knew that the most feared reptilian matriarch in the sector had just ordered 200 soft, warm blankets in dark green for her warships because a human had shown her children that comfort was not a sin. Said a single word about it, because the galaxy had its cruelties, but it also had its kindnesses. And one of those kindnesses was the unspoken agreement among all sentient beings that when someone powerful learns something tender, you let them have their dignity. Elena heard about the requisition from Dr. Osei, who told her over coffee with a grin so wide it looked like it might split her face, and Elena laughed until her ribs hurt, and then she went back to the creche because it was almost 1200 hours, and she had a job to do. The creche at midday was Elena's favorite place in the galaxy. The lights were low, and the lullaby hummed through the walls, and the blankets were spread in a nest that the cubs had arranged with the architectural precision of creatures who took their comfort very seriously. Elena sat down in the center, and the pile formed around her the way it always did, not all at once, but in waves, each cub finding their spot, with the ease of long practice. Kale pressed against her left side, his silver fur warm through her uniform, his torn ear twitching once before going still, and his breathing was slow and deep before his eyes even closed, because his body knew this place, and this time, and this person, and it trusted all three completely. Fesic draped across her shins, her scales cool at first, and then warming as her body drew heat from Elena's, and her tail curled around Elena's ankle in a loose grip that tightened slightly as she fell asleep. A tiny, unconscious gesture that said, "You are here, and I am here, and that is enough." A new pup, only 2 weeks in the creche, still skittish, still learning, climbed onto Elena's stomach and turned in 3 circles before collapsing in a heap of pale fur and outsized paws. And Elena rested her hand on his back and felt his heartbeat slow under her palm, like a clock winding down to the right time. The other cubs filled in around them, fur against scales, claws retracted, breath mingling, and the pile grew until it was a single warm breathing thing that rose and fell together in the amber light. Elena closed her eyes. She heard the footstep before she saw him, but she did not need to see him because she knew the weight of it and the rhythm of it and the way the air changed when he entered a room. Vorax stood in the doorway, filling it almost completely, his 6 arms at his sides, and his gold eyes moving across the pile of sleeping cubs and the human woman at its center. And he stood there for a long time, without moving, and his face was not hard and not soft, but something in between that was perhaps the truest expression he had ever worn, which was the face of someone who was learning that the things he had been most afraid of were the things he needed most. He stepped inside. He settled against the far wall with his back straight and his legs stretched out and his 6 arms folded, and he closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, and the last of the tension left his body like water leaving a cracked vessel. Behind him, barely visible around the corner of the doorway, a dark-scaled tail rested on the floor in a long, relaxed curve. And if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen that the tail was attached to Matriarch Ishka, who was already asleep, because Skarathi did not do anything by half measure, and that included naps. Elena smiled under the pile. She did not open her eyes. She did not need to. The room was warm, and the music was low, and the cubs were safe, and the warriors were resting, and somewhere outside the station, the galaxy continued to be vast and cold, and full of things that wanted to eat you. But in here, in this small, padded, claw-marked room with its squeaky floor, and its soft blankets, and its pile of sleeping predators, the galaxy could wait. Humans did not conquer the stars with warships or weapons or the cold calculus of empire. They did it with the radical, terrifying, absolutely unhinged idea that sometimes, even if you were the most dangerous thing in the room, it was okay to just rest. And if you rested together, you woke up family.